Pablo had inflamed the situation immediately by giving an interview with a local radio station as soon as he had established himself at a safe house. In this, he taunted the government and his opponents by outlining details of how he had escaped, but there was certainly an element of caution here too. Escobar made it clear in the interview that he was willing to come back into custody if certain conditions could be met, specifically that he would be allowed to serve out the remainder of the agreed sentence at La Catedral. But the government had had enough. No new terms were offered, and the manhunt was stepped up. The collaboration between Search Block and the American Delta Force and Special Operations units was now openly to be seen on the streets of Medellín and Bogotá as units made house-to-house searches and attempted to track down Escobar's closest associates. In December 1992, they came very close to apprehending the drug lord when they raided a safe house he was using. Pablo had only moved from it hours earlier, but progress was being made in other ways, as many of Escobar's supporters and facilitators began to turn their back on an individual who they now saw as doomed to be apprehended eventually, and as the price of remaining loyal became even higher. A clear indication of these shifting fortunes was seen when Pablo's brother-in-law was killed by Los Pepes. In the end, Escobar managed to evade the authorities for nearly a year and a half after his flight from La Catedral. He was finally caught owing to a surveillance operation which managed to trace his cell phone transmissions in the early winter of 1993. As a result, Search Block and US operatives determined that Escobar was holed up in another safe house in Los Olivos, a middle-class neighborhood in Medellín. They moved on the 2nd of December 1993. A unit of 8 burst through the door, following which Escobar and his bodyguard that day, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, or El Limón as he was known, ran out onto the roof of the building and made an effort to escape across the roofs of the adjoining houses. It is not 100% clear what happened next. Gunfire was exchanged, and moments later Pablo was lying dead on the rooftop, bullets having hit him in his leg, torso, and ear. The shot to the ear entered his head and killed him, but there is a suspicion that Escobar delivered this bullet himself, having determined some time earlier that he would commit suicide before ever facing the possibility of being extradited to the United States. Pablo's brother and close confidant Roberto later claimed Pablo had always asserted he would shoot himself through the ear if cornered in this fashion. Whatever the truth of it, the result was the same. On the 2nd of December 1993, just one day after his 44th birthday, and 17 or so years after the emergence of the Medellín cartel, the man known as El Patron, the boss, was killed in Medellín. Despite the violence he had unleashed, the Robin Hood image Escobar had cultivated for himself remained strong. Over 25,000 mourners turned out for his funeral. In the aftermath of Escobar's death, the Cali cartel for a time moved to become the biggest manufacturer and trafficker of cocaine in Colombia. However, it faced stiff competition from a new organization, the Norte de Valle Cartel, or North Valley Cartel, which had first emerged in the final years of Pablo's life in the Valle del Cauca region. Both outfits were increasingly looking to transport their cocaine north to Mexico, which became the new entry point into the United States as the Caribbean routes to Florida and the East Coast became ever more difficult to traffic through in the 1990s. And eventually, the Cali cartel too would largely be dismantled and fragmented in the mid-1990s, and further successor syndicates appeared, notably the North Coast Cartel, based out of the northern city of Barranquilla, and with particular focus on supplying networks to the Eastern Europe, while also rejuvenating some of Pablo's older supply lines north to the East Coast cities of the United States. All of these others in their own time have come and gone and been replaced by newer organizations, each with a determination to use ever more violent methods to establish themselves. Today, Colombia is a country which is gradually recovering from the drug cartels and the political conflicts which ripped it apart in the second half of the 20th century and allowed figures such as Escobar to flourish. In 2016, an historic ceasefire agreement was introduced between the Colombian government and the FARC rebels, offering the possibility of an end being brought to half a century of paramilitary violence in the country. And the city of Medellín has prospered since Escobar's demise. Crime rates in the city decreased rapidly in the aftermath of the collapse of the Medellín cartel in the mid-1990s, and the city has benefited from investment and the development of a major transport infrastructure, which has seen it become a hub of industry and business within Colombia once again in the early 21st century. Today, the city is internationally acclaimed for its development of an environmental and innovative public transport system, a far cry from its position 30 years ago as the homicide capital of the world under Escobar's auspices. Other signs of Escobar's influence are still visible. La Catedral was left abandoned for many years in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but in 2007, a group of Benedictine monks took it over and turned it into a religious site, complete with a library and other amenities. Meanwhile, the hippos have increased in number and are still wandering around the grounds of the Hacienda Nápoles. Pablo Escobar was something of an enigmatic figure. He grew up in the urban squalor of Medellín, a place which had developed from a small town into a city of over 1 million people during the course of the half-century between the 1920s and the 1970s. Moreover, he emerged as a drug trafficker at a time when Colombia was in the midst of mass political violence, effectively a civil war, and as the country also became the global capital of the production of cocaine. Consequently, it is easy to imagine that if Escobar had not emerged as the head of the Medellín cartel, somebody else would have come to prominence in the Colombian drug trade anyway, whether in Medellín, Cali, or elsewhere. It could also be argued that he did much to help the poor and disenfranchised, particularly in his hometown at a time when Colombia was suffering from appalling poverty, and many had effectively been abandoned by the government in Bogotá. Pablo gave handouts to the poor, created jobs, and developed Medellín's infrastructure. He even allowed people free access to his zoo at Hacienda Nápoles, and buoyed people's spirits by funding Atlético Nacional football team to such an extent that they won the Copa Libertadores in 1989. This was the Robin Hood type image of himself which Escobar attempted to cultivate. The reality is far grimmer though. Escobar was a mass murderer who sank Colombia and Medellín in particular into levels of violence and bloodshed which were unprecedented. It is certainly true that the country had many problems which were not of his making, but it was his increasingly determined efforts to wage war on the Colombian government and rivals such as the Cali cartel from the mid-1980s onwards which saw the country reach the point where over 25,000 violent deaths were occurring every year, nearly 1/3 of them alone in Medellín. Moreover, Escobar might have been willing to give away much of his wealth, most of which could not be used by the cartel anyway by the mid to late 1980s, but he was equally willing to murder scores or even hundreds of innocent bystanders at a time in efforts to kill his enemies, such as occurred with Avianca Flight 203 and the Department of Security bombing in November and December 1989. Once his malevolent influence was removed in the mid-1990s, Medellín and Colombia gradually started to make some progress towards reforming the city and the country. Consequently, while Escobar might have claimed that he was simply a decent man who sells flowers, the reality was far different. What do you think of Pablo Escobar? Was he the Colombian Robin Hood type figure he tried to portray himself as, or was he simply a ruthless mass murderer and a profiteer? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.